It's probably going to be the hardest work of literature you've ever read in your life, but it's also going to be one of the most satisfying and memorable experiences of your high school career. Before you plunge into reading Romeo and Juliet, though, you're going to learn about Shakespeare's life and times. You're going to learn about where Shakespeare lived his life, where Romeo and Juliet is set, and what else was going on in the world during Shakespeare's time. You and I have no idea what Romeo may have looked like. All we know is he is supposed to be a handsome and rich young man living in Italy in the Middle Ages. All we know about Juliet is she's about 13 years old, beautiful, and able to capture young Romeo's heart. These two young lovers, who marry but do not consummate their marriage, in other words, they do not have sexual relations, these two young lovers eat of the fruit of forbidden love. Their parents do not want them to marry, and their parents get in the way of their marriage. No matter how hard they try, Romeo and Juliet's love seems doomed to failure. It is the great English poet and dramatist William Shakespeare who wrote this play for his London audiences in 1597, and Romeo and Juliet has taken the world by storm since then. Shakespeare, however, did not develop Romeo and Juliet from scratch. He based Romeo and Juliet on a story written by an old Italian author. A story about a young Italian boy named Romeo and a young Italian girl named Giulietta, who fall madly in love even though their families hate each other. Shakespeare was very good at using other authors' works as an inspiration for his own. Almost all his plays are based off an older story by another author. Shakespeare was able to flesh out and develop other authors' works, and then become famous in doing so. Maybe that's the secret to becoming a rich and famous author. Anyway, when we're talking about Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet, we're talking about Europe and European culture. More specifically, we're talking about two countries, England and Italy. England is where Shakespeare was born, lived, and died. Italy is where Romeo and Juliet takes place. England, as you know, is a part of the modern country called the United Kingdom. Another name many people use for the United Kingdom is Great Britain. England is only one part of the United Kingdom, or Great Britain. To the north of England is Scotland. To the west of England is Wales. Shakespeare was born in a little English town called Stratford-upon-Avon in the year 1564. The town of Stratford is situated right on the banks of the river Avon, hence the name Stratford-upon-Avon. In the 21st century, Stratford-upon-Avon is a bustling little town with pretty old houses and buildings. Shakespeare-themed restaurants and pubs help attract tens of thousands of tourists to Stratford every year. You could say that Shakespeare put this quiet little English town on the map. Back in his day, hardly anyone took notice of Stratford. Shakespeare spent his childhood and young adult years here along the banks of the river Avon, and by the time he was only 17, he had outgrown this small town and moved to London to pursue his career. But Shakespeare did not leave Stratford forever. In his early 50s, he bought a house in Stratford and retired here after a long career in the bustling city of London. This is the house Shakespeare was born in and grew up in, here in Stratford. This house is over 500 years old. Every year, tourists from all over the world come to this house to pay tribute to the man who many people believe to be the greatest writer of all time. Although Stratford's a charming town, it was no place for an ambitious young man like William Shakespeare to enjoy a successful literary career. Shakespeare wanted success, so he had no choice but to move to London. When you and I think about modern London, we probably think about places like Buckingham Palace, the Queen's official residence. Or we think about the red-coated guards with the fuzzy hats, who risk life and limb guarding Her Majesty. Not long ago, millions of people around the world tuned in for the wedding ceremony of Prince William and Kate, who were married here in Westminster Abbey, the same place where Princess Diana's funeral was held. And in London, don't forget about Big Ben, with its enormous bell chiming the hour. And there's Tower Bridge, where you can drive through two magnificent stone towers as you cross the River Thames. And there's St. Paul's Cathedral, with its great dome, which survived terrible bombing by the Nazis in World War II. And who could forget the London Eye, that famous Ferris wheel on the River Thames with its amazing views of the city skyline. But nestled away from the most famous London tourist attractions is a little gem called the Globe Theatre. Shakespeare's plays were performed at the Globe Theatre in the late 16th and early 17th century, but the original Globe Theatre from Shakespeare's time burned down. The new Globe Theatre, which you see here, is a replica of the original. In Shakespeare's time, this theater was called the Globe because you could come here and see all the world on its stage. For instance, if you took in a performance of Romeo and Juliet, you would be transported to the magic of medieval Italy. Theater goers in Shakespeare's time were not as well behaved as they are today. If you could travel back in time to a performance at the original Globe Theatre, you'd see members of the audience brawling, spitting, talking loudly, and even interrupting the actors in the middle of a performance. Wealthy people bought tickets for seats in the balconies so they could be away from the fighting and wrestling of the crowds, who were standing or sitting in the pit in front of the stage. It could get very wild in the pit. In fact, in Shakespeare's time, going to a play was like going to a rock concert today, or to a hockey game or a boxing match. Anyway, the Globe Theatre is one of the many fabulous attractions you can visit when you go to London one day. But let's leave London and its elegant skyline for a moment and transport ourselves over to the southern part of Europe, to where Romeo and Juliet takes place, in the gorgeous cities and countryside of northern Italy. Northern Italy is an important location in Shakespeare's works. In fact, he set nearly 1/3 of his plays in northern Italy. You're probably familiar with northern Italy's two most famous cities, Milan and Venice. Milan is an international center for fashion, design, and the arts. It's also one of the world's wealthiest cities because so many banks have their headquarters there. Venice, over by the sea, is famous for its canals and gondolas, which are like water taxis you can take around the city. But situated between Milan and Venice are two smaller cities, and it's in these smaller cities that Romeo and Juliet is set. Most of the action of Romeo and Juliet is set in the city of Verona. There is also a very important scene of Romeo and Juliet set in the city of Mantua, just down the road from Verona. Verona is not Italy's most famous city, not by a long shot. But Shakespeare set Romeo and Juliet here for reasons that are still mysterious to scholars of literature. Perhaps what attracted Shakespeare to Verona is the gorgeous blue river running through the center of town, reminiscent of the river Avon in his hometown of Stratford-upon-Avon. At any rate, Verona bursts with beauty and charm, the perfect backdrop for a romantic tragedy like Romeo and Juliet. Every year, tens of thousands of tourists from all over the world visit Little Verona to indulge in romantic feelings that they associate with Romeo and Juliet. There is no evidence that Shakespeare ever visited Verona in his lifetime, or even Italy for that matter. However, historians have concluded that they know nothing about where Shakespeare lived or what he did between the years 1578 and 1582. These years are known as Shakespeare's lost years. Perhaps during that time Shakespeare was traveling and maybe he spent time in Italy soaking up the culture. We don't know. The beautiful mansions of Verona can make you feel as if you're looking at the homes of Romeo and Juliet themselves, both of whom are said to have come from wealthy, powerful families in the play. You can still walk through Verona's main squares and feel transported back to a time 600 or 700 years ago. Italians, in the past and to this day, have always enjoyed eating and drinking outside, on the sidewalks of their streets and squares. This is called dining al fresco, which in English means in the open or fresh air. A fun fact about many churches in Verona is that they're built with alternating layers of stone. A layer of light-colored stone and then a layer of dark-colored stone, etc. It seems to be a special style unique to the churches of Verona. Verona and all of Italy is a usually sunny and warm place. The climate is Mediterranean, which means it's warm and dry. For centuries, people from cold northern European countries like England have come to Italy to escape the chilly, damp air of their homelands. You could say that for English and German people, Italy was, and still is, their version of Florida. Verona still has an old Roman amphitheater, built in the year 30. If you visit Verona, you can still see plays in this amphitheater. In fact, in 2026, when the Winter Olympics come to northern Italy, the opening and closing ceremonies of those Olympics will be held right here in Verona's amphitheater. Well, let's head down the road from Verona to Mantua, because there's an important scene in Romeo and Juliet that's set in Mantua. Mantua, like Verona, is situated on a river, and it boasts a beautiful cathedral in its center. The buildings you see in the foreground, right by the river, would have existed in Romeo and Juliet's time. But the big church in the background was built later, closer to when Shakespeare was alive. let's leave beautiful sunny Italy for the moment and return to cool, damp England, where Shakespeare lived, worked, and died. England was the land that made Shakespeare famous, and English was the language he wrote in. The England of Shakespeare's time was a wild, exciting place, and you'll learn more about Shakespeare's England when you study European history later in high school. England's queen for most of Shakespeare's life was Elizabeth I, known as the Virgin Queen because she never married. In fact, the state of Virginia is named in honor of Elizabeth's virginity. And Elizabeth remained single because she was a Protestant, and there were no eligible Protestant princes in Europe for her to marry. All the eligible bachelors were Roman Catholic, but Elizabeth did not want to share her throne with a Roman Catholic. And so Elizabeth ruled England by herself, and she proved many, many men wrong who at the start of her reign said that she could never rule England the way a man could. Elizabeth I ruled England with wisdom and strength. The English economy did exceedingly well under her, and talented men such as Shakespeare were at liberty to produce outstanding works of art. After Queen Elizabeth I died, a distant relative of hers, named James, became King of England. James was king when Shakespeare became an old man, retired, and died. James was originally the King of Scotland, but because Elizabeth had no children, James also became King of England. And so, during James's reign, he worked to unite Scotland and England under one crown. King James also was responsible for hiring scholars to produce what is known as the King James Bible, arguably the most famous English-language version of Scripture. King James had a long and complicated reign, and historians believe he had many lovers, both female as well as male. During James's reign, English colonists began founding towns in Virginia. The famous settlement of Jamestown, Virginia, is named after old King James. You know, Shakespeare was not the only English writer of his time. The young man you see here was Shakespeare's arch-rival in the world of London literature. This man is Christopher Marlowe, who was slightly older than Shakespeare and who became a famous writer before Shakespeare did. Christopher Marlowe died at a very young age, however, and under mysterious circumstances. If he had lived longer, perhaps high school students around the world would be reading Christopher Marlowe's works instead of William Shakespeare's. Life in Shakespeare's England was clouded by religious controversy. The man you see here, King Henry VIII, had broken away from the Roman Catholic Church decades before Shakespeare was born. King Henry VIII then declared himself head of the Church of England. As a result of Henry's break with the Roman Catholic Church, England entered many decades of religious conflict, a power struggle between Catholics and Protestants to see which religion would be dominant in England. This power struggle between Catholics and Protestants was brutal and terrifying. When Catholics managed to gain control of England, they would burn as many Protestants at the stake as they could. And when Protestants managed to gain control, they too would go on a Catholic burning crusade. For many decades of Shakespeare's life, the ultimate question in English politics and society was, are you a Catholic or are you a Protestant? and the answer to that question could have a fateful and decisive outcome for you. Shakespeare's time, then, was a period of religious controversy and conflict. But it was also a time of exploration, and English sailors in Shakespeare's time began establishing colonies in North America, in what is now known as Virginia. English colonists brought Virginia tobacco back to London, and soon wealthy English aristocrats were hooked on American tobacco. Growing tobacco in Virginia, then, became a way for English businessmen to get rich quick. But not only England was colonizing the Americas at this time. Spain was colonizing too, in Mexico and in South America. Spain wanted gold and silver from Latin America's mines. But someone else wanted that gold and silver too. English pirates. With Queen Elizabeth's blessing, English pirates raided Spanish ships and carried away their gold and silver. The pirates gave some of the gold and silver to the Queen. The rest they got to keep for themselves as a reward. The lesson: crime does pay so long as you have the Queen's permission. Pretty soon, the King of Spain was fed up with English pirates attacking his ships and taking his gold and silver away. So Spain launched a giant naval crusade against England during Shakespeare's life. The idea was to invade England, remove Elizabeth from the throne, and replace her with a monarch more friendly to Spain's interests. This great Spanish naval crusade is known in history as the Spanish Armada. The King of Spain sent hundreds of his best ships and thousands of his best commanders and sailors to bring England to its knees. But the Spanish Armada encountered a maritime storm on the way to England, and then a resounding defeat at the hands of England's navy. England was saved from invasion. The Spanish navy went home in tatters. England rejoiced. But England's rejoicing was punctuated by frequent grief and loss due to the recurrence of the plague. Throughout Shakespeare's life, the plague reared its deathly head. As this illustration from Shakespeare's time reads, "Lord, have mercy on London." Death, portrayed as a skeleton, says, "I follow." The people lying by the haystacks say, "We die." The people running away from the skeleton say, "We fly." During much of Shakespeare's life, the streets of London were often filled with the bodies of people who had succumbed to the plague. Perhaps Shakespeare's plays at the Globe Theatre were a welcome relief for people who wanted to enjoy the moment because they knew they could very well be dead the next day. Many people in the 21st century take a look at the language Shakespeare used and say that it is Old English because it employs many old-fashioned words and expressions. But Shakespeare did not write in Old English. He wrote in what's called Early Modern English. So what's the difference? The manuscript you see in front of you right now is written in Old English. Can you read it? The handwriting is very old indeed. On the right-hand side of your screen, you can see what it says in a modern font. These are the words of the Lord's Prayer, also known as the Our Father. Let me read what it says to you in Old English. Feder ura, thu the art on helfonum, zidin nama gahalgod, kuma din richa, gewurda din villa, on eordan swaswa on helfonum. This is not Shakespearean English. This is Old English from over 1,000 years ago. Here's a line-by-line translation of this Old English prayer into early modern English, which is the English Shakespeare used. Fader ure thu the art on helfonum. In early modern English, Our Father, which art in heaven. Zidin name gehalgod. In early modern English, hallowed be thy name. Kuma din richa, gewurda din villa. In early modern English, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. On eordan swaswa on helfonum. In early modern English, on earth as it is in heaven. As you can see, Old English is totally another language. It was spoken hundreds of years before Shakespeare was born. Shakespeare's English, or early modern English, is still old-fashioned to us nowadays, but it is much more understandable than Old English. Here is Shakespeare's famous Sonnet 18, written in perfect early modern English. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Romeo and Juliet is about many things: young romance, frustrated passion, and tragic death. It's also about two feuding families, the Montagues and the Capulets, two families who hate each other with a white-hot passion. They've been feuding for a long time. The family feud between the Montagues and Capulets spills over into a bloody sword fight and results in horrible tragedy for both families. Feuding families at war with each other was a common occurrence in old Europe, and it has been a common reality in other parts of the world too. Think Bushes versus Clintons, or Trumps versus Bidens, except with actual bloodshed. Sadly, the feud between the Montague and Capulet families ends with the deaths of Romeo and Juliet. Only in the end, as they are standing over the dead bodies of Romeo and Juliet, are the Montagues and Capulets finally reconciled, ending their long-standing family feud. Romeo and Juliet is also about parental expectations regarding marriage. In old Europe, parents expected to be able to govern their children's choices about whom to marry. Very powerful families with huge fortunes expected their sons and daughters to marry for political and economic reasons. The idea of marrying for love was simply not the most important idea in the heads of powerful, wealthy parents. Loyal sons and daughters of powerful families were expected to marry someone who would increase the family's wealth and prestige. No questions asked. Also, Romeo and Juliet is a story about young love. Very young love. Juliet, we are told, is only 13 years old. Strange as it may seem to us nowadays, in the Middle Ages, girls of 13 were considered ripe and ready to leave their parents' home and marry a wealthy older man. Enter in the Catholic Church. In Romeo and Juliet, a Catholic monk performs Romeo and Juliet's wedding in secret. This monk, called Friar Lawrence, knows all about the long-standing feud between Romeo and Juliet's families. He knows Romeo and Juliet's parents will not approve of the marriage. So, what does the good monk Friar Lawrence do? He performs Romeo and Juliet's wedding in secret, without the approval of the parents. This is because the Catholic Church held that men and women should be allowed to marry whomever they wanted, even if their parents did not give consent. Old Friar Lawrence thus sets himself up against the wishes of Romeo and Juliet's powerful, angry parents, and all in the name of upholding what Friar Lawrence believes is Romeo and Juliet's God-given right to marry each other if they so choose. We've already discussed the setting of Romeo and Juliet, and here's a little refresher. There's Rome, which is now the capital of modern Italy. You'll see that in the Middle Ages, though, Rome was not a part of Italy, but was a city in the Papal States. Look at Milan. Milan was a city in a country known as the Duchy of Milan. Look at Venice. Venice was a city in a country called the Republic of Venice. And there's Verona, also in the Republic of Venice. And look at little Mantua. Mantua was in a tiny independent country all by itself. You can see that Italy was actually divided up into many small countries. You'll see later why this is important in Romeo and Juliet. Romeo, after he marries Juliet, decides he'll go into exile in a different part of Italy so that Juliet's parents can't catch him and take revenge on him. Back then, it was fairly common for people who had broken the law to escape to another country and live the rest of their lives there. That's what the expression, go into exile, means. Could you imagine loving someone so much you'd be willing to run away to Canada or Mexico and live there the rest of your life? I don't know about you, but I could imagine myself doing something like that. Maybe not right now in my 30s, but definitely back in my 20s. Anyway, there's something else you should know about the time when Shakespeare was writing. Back then, English people had a stereotype in their minds about people in Southern Europe. English people thought that the people in countries like Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece were extremely passionate because those countries get a lot of warm weather and sunshine. Shakespeare, by setting Romeo and Juliet in a country like Italy, was playing on his audience's prejudice. The audience expected Italian characters to be romantic, violent, and passionate, even flaming with passion. Whereas the English audience believed themselves to be cool, reasonable, and rational, just like other Northern Europeans. So let's review what we've learned about Shakespeare's life and times. Shakespeare was born in this house you see in front of you in Stratford-upon-Avon in England. Shakespeare worked in London. You can still see many modern productions of Shakespeare's plays at the Globe Theatre in London. Romeo and Juliet is set in northern Italy, in the city of Verona, and there's also a little scene in Mantua. During Shakespeare's life, there were two monarchs on the throne of England. The first was Elizabeth I, and the monarch when Shakespeare grew old and died was James I. Shakespeare's life was a time of religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, and many people were burned for their faith. During Shakespeare's time, the English colonized America, especially what is now Virginia. Shakespeare's time was a time of pirates. It was also a time when the Spanish Armada tried to invade England. Shakespeare's time was a time of plague and pestilence. Remember that Shakespeare did not write in Old English, but in early modern English. Old English is so old, we can't even understand it anymore. Remember also that the feud between the Capulets and the Montagues is nothing new. There have been many family feuds between families for thousands of years. If you do a quick Google search for family feuds, you'll be surprised by what you find. Marriages were political and economic affairs. Parents usually expected their children to marry someone the parents approved of for political or economic reasons. And most people did not marry for love in the sense we now think of it. In the Middle Ages, it was totally normal for a girl of 13 to leave her parents' home, get married, and start bearing children. Friar Lawrence, the priest in Romeo and Juliet, plays an important role because he gives his blessing to Romeo and Juliet's marriage, even though he knows Romeo and Juliet's parents disapprove. William Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet about 450 years ago. It was long ago in cold, damp London, England, where William Shakespeare sat down at a table with candlelight and wrote with a quill. Nevertheless, Romeo and Juliet is still a world-famous play read by high school students in the United States, in Europe, in Africa, Asia, Australia, South America, and wherever human language is spoken. It is a play that touches many people's hearts and souls, and it is a play you are fortunate enough to read right now in grade 9. Now you have a very good background understanding of William Shakespeare's life and times.